Hi there, this is Dr. Marks, and we're going to look at trade barriers, specifically two simple ones, tariffs and quotas. Now, if you are in the business school and have already had international economics, this content might be very familiar to you. We're not going to cover this with technical graphs like we might in a hardcore economics class, so let's focus on the intuition. Economists overwhelmingly favor free trade, and we've already talked about this idea. And opportunities for free trade have been expanded all across the globe through things like free trade agreements and trading blocs. So you're probably familiar with NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. You're familiar with the European Union, a trading bloc. However, much of the world's trade is not free, which means instead it's got trade barriers in place. And those trade barriers are intended to constrain trade, to limit trade. So we need to understand the basics of trade barriers. And specifically, as I said, we're going to focus on quotas and tariffs. As we do this, we need to think about who wins and who loses under these policies. So make sure when we're done with this lecture, you can articulate that idea. Tariffs and quotas are the simplest form of trade barriers, and they can actually get complicated. Sometimes they're combined into these kind of multi-part trade barriers, and we're going to keep it simple for our purposes. But just understand that anything that I could teach you with more sophisticated forms of trade barriers, we can learn this way, keeping it simple. A tariff is a tax that's imposed on an import. Let's say the United States puts a tax on clothing that's imported from Asia. Well, that would be an example of a tariff. Now, the intuition here is pretty straightforward, right? The tax makes the import a bit more expensive. As soon as we put the tax in place, we know that the cost of that Asian clothing is going to go up. And for a tariff, government gets a little revenue, but let's be clear. The revenue that governments make from tariffs generally isn't large relative to their entire budget. If we were to pull the United States government's budget and look at the tax revenue from tariffs, yeah, it would add up to a bit, but as a percentage, it would be pretty small. So our motive isn't necessarily just revenue. Usually our motive is having to do with something about wanting to favor certain groups or penalize other groups. You'll get the idea. But it's not generally to have revenue. It's just not big enough for it to be the overall motivation. Another option for imposing a trade barrier is a quota. A quota is a little different. A quota is a restriction on the number of units that can be imported. So a tariff is a tax, we're just directly taxing something, but a quota is more indirect. We're going to restrict the number of units that can be imported. For example, the United States puts quotas on vehicles imported from Germany. So think about what's going to happen when we do that. That is going to change the game just a little bit. So let's think about what's happening when we impose that quota on German cars. Now, there are fewer of these cars imported. So there's fewer of these German cars in the United States for people to buy, which means they are scarcer. Now, if something is scarcer, I know you can predict what's going to happen to price, right? Like strawberries in winter, they become a little more scarce, and what happens to price? Price goes up. So the quota also affects the price of the import, but it does it in a little more indirect way by making that good scarcer, which means the price goes up. Both of the trade barriers we've just discussed had the same effect. The tariff and the quota work differently, but they end up with the same result. Both made price of the import increase. Remember, that tariff is a tax, so it just automatically makes the price of the import increase. And when we made German cars more scarce by limiting the number, that made price go up. So again, be clear that one does it directly through the tax, that's the tariff, and the other does it indirectly by making something scarcer. But as I said, they both have the same effect. Now let's think about who wins and who loses under these policies. Let's stick with our examples of cars. And so in this case, we're going to have the US putting a quota on foreign vehicles. So let's assume it's not just German vehicles this time, it's all foreign vehicles, which we've already explained makes price higher because they're more scarce, there's not as many of them. Can we think about who benefits from imported cars, foreign car brands being more expensive in the United States? So when those Japanese cars that we import cost more and those German cars we import cost more, who benefits from that? Well, what about American car producers? Do American car producers benefit when the substitutes are more expensive? Sure, of course they do. So let's think about Ford and GM. They want the substitutes to be as expensive as possible, right? They want Hondas to be expensive. They want Toyotas to be expensive. They want all those cars that compete with them to be more expensive. Now, some people are still going to buy the import, right? You know, if you want a BMW, you're probably not substituting to a Ford, but there will be people who substitute to an American brand. This clearly has benefited American car producers. So the demand for domestic vehicles is going to increase. So let's just go back and make sure that we connect the dots. So we put a quota in place on foreign vehicles, that price went up, which means American car producers benefit because people are going to substitute to the American brands, and demand for domestic vehicles, American vehicles, is going to go up. So Ford and GM, for example, are going to be clear winners in this deal. They clearly want us to have trade barriers on foreign vehicles. Let's keep in mind one thing, and that is that the trade barrier made foreign vehicles more expensive. We already understand that. And so demand increased for the American vehicles. We understand that. But here's something we need to realize. Increased demand for American vehicles also bids up the price. It may not be a huge bid up in price, but increasing demand for American vehicles does mean that American vehicles may go up a little bit in price. Again, not that much necessarily, but here's the punchline. Both foreign vehicles and American vehicle prices are higher. This means everybody loses a little bit, right? So think about how that impacts American consumers of cars. We've got everything now costing more. So when everyone pays more, that means there's other things that we can't buy instead. So there are going to be costs to imposing these kinds of trade barriers, and we need to realize that. So we have winners. We've talked about GM and Ford win, but purchasers of foreign vehicles, they lose because price is higher, and purchasers of American vehicles lose a bit because those prices are a little higher. We just illustrated the motivation for some trade barriers, right? A key motivation of trade barriers, a big winner, is the domestic industry. So one big motivation might be to protect the domestic industry. When we put in these kinds of trade barriers, American car producers see less competition from foreign brands, right? And guys, who doesn't want to be protected from competition? So American car producers should be saying, yippee, let's put those trade barriers in place on foreign vehicles. They're going to be all for it, right? The trade barrier stimulated demand for the American alternative. So Ford and GM are selling more cars than they might have before we had any kind of trade barriers. We can do this in another way, right? We can simply have a Buy American campaign and try to educate people on the importance of buying American and supporting our domestic industries. But we can also use trade barriers to more directly have this kind of effect. So a Buy American campaign may or may not work, but the trade barriers, we're pretty sure, are going to work because they directly impact the prices, as we've just seen. Let's continue to talk about losers under trade barriers. We need to remember that there are losers with trade barriers, and we just talked about a couple, right? anybody who wants the foreign vehicle, and now prices of American vehicles have gone up, so everyone's paying a little more. But let's just be clear. What if you're an American who wants to drive a Porsche? Are you a winner or are you a loser? Well, hopefully you realize if you're an American who wants to drive a Porsche, you are a loser in this game. You're now paying a higher price for that Porsche because it's subject to a quota. But it also hurts the foreign supplier, right? In this case, Porsche's going to sell fewer cars in the United States. And you might be thinking, oh, boohoo, poor Porsche. Well, it's a rich company, right? But what if we were talking about a tariff on t-shirts from Cambodia, right? I don't think we want to argue that a t-shirt company in Cambodia is super duper rich and, whatever, it's not going to affect them a whole lot. So understand that when we put these kinds of trade barriers in place, it's not just on big dollar products from rich companies, right? It could be on a whole lot of things. It could be rice from Thailand. So again, if we put a tariff on t-shirts from Cambodia, then those companies sell fewer t-shirts in the United States. And clearly this hurts the Cambodian business. So while my examples have all been kind of skewed towards big companies selling expensive products, not all tariffs and quotas are on just those kinds of things. Hopefully, our discussion makes it really transparent that trade barriers result in a trade-off. Some people are better off and some companies are better off, right? So GM and Ford are better off when we put trade barriers in place for foreign vehicles, but some are worse off. The person who wants the Porsche is worse off, and Americans may be worse off when they're buying Ford and GM cars because demand's gone up and price has gone up a little bit. And of course, the company that sells the foreign cars, they're worse off. But let's think about how this would impact developing countries, because developing countries need to access large markets, right? Like the United States, this is an important part of their development to be engaged in global trade and have places to sell their products. So when we impose trade barriers, like putting a tariff in place on t-shirts coming from Cambodia, there can be significant effects, and those can be real. For example, we have quotas in place for sugar. Now, we do it to protect our domestic sugar industry. We're not competitive in sugar. If we were just trying to have a free market in sugar, our sugar farmers would be out of business. We just cannot compete with foreign competition. So we put quotas in place to make sure that there's not as much competition. All right, well, that's good for the farmers in the United States for sugar, but this means a country like Dominican Republic can't sell us as much sugar. Dominican Republic is a developing country, and they sure would benefit from being able to sell as much sugar as they possibly could to the United States market. It's a big market, it's a rich market. So we are hurting them when we put these kinds of trade barriers in place. Let's test our understanding to make sure all of this has made some sense. Let's say you're an American producer of microwaves. Are you going to favor trade barriers for microwaves? And I'm talking about foreign microwaves coming into your country. What's the answer? Hopefully, you've agreed yes. If you're an American producer of microwaves, you want to be protected from competition. So if there are foreign microwaves coming in, you want to have as few of those as possible. Let's say you're a big consumer of Chilean wine. So you're a consumer, not a producer. Do you want trade barriers on foreign wine? What's the answer? The answer is for you, no, because you want to buy Chilean wine, which is from Chile, which is a foreign country. When trade barriers are in place for Chilean wine, it's going to mean that Chilean wine is going to cost more. And if you're a consumer of Chilean wine, you don't want to pay higher prices. Let's say that your company owns vineyards in California and you are a regional producer of wine. Do you want trade barriers for foreign wine? Yes or no? Well, hopefully you came up with the answer, yes, you do want trade barriers for foreign wine because that's going to reduce the competition to you. Anything that keeps less foreign wine from coming into the United States works in your favor, right? But what about this question? Do you want, as a company that owns vineyards in California, do you want other countries to have trade barriers for American wine? Now we're going in the other direction. Do you want other countries to have trade barriers for American wine? The answer is no. You don't want trade barriers. You want to be able to sell as much as you can to other countries if you're involved in that activity. I guess if you're not, you don't really care. But if you're shipping your wine out for export, yeah, you don't want trade barriers. Trade agreements, fortunately, have created pockets of free trade. We see trade agreements all over the place. And as you've learned, Thailand is involved in some of these trade agreements. And that means it gives them access to other markets. And gang, as I keep saying, trade is a key element in economic development. When you can get involved in global trade and have access to markets and sell more stuff, that's great, right? So when Thailand participates in these trade agreements, it gives them other places to sell their stuff, and they can sell that stuff without tariffs and quotas. That's the point of the free trade agreement, that there's not going to be tariffs and quotas in place, which should mean more stuff is purchased from Thailand, right? Let's think about why that is. If other countries in the trade agreement can buy stuff from Thailand without tariffs and quotas in place, then the price is going to be lower. Remember, tariffs and quotas raise price, so when we don't have tariffs and quotas, that makes the price lower. So if Thailand has these other member nations who can buy from Thailand without trade barriers, they're more likely to purchase more stuff because it's going to be cheaper. It also means that Thailand can buy stuff without higher prices that come from trade barriers. So again, Thailand benefits when it goes to purchase stuff because it can purchase stuff from other member nations, other countries that are part of this trade agreement, and they won't have imposed quotas and tariffs. So you see the win-win back and forth. You sell more stuff, but you can also buy stuff more cheaply when you're participating in these trade agreements. You've heard me say that economists are overwhelmingly in favor of free trade, but while we are promoting free trade, there might be times when trade barriers are justified, and economists acknowledge this, that sometimes we do use them and it does make sense to use them. For example, they are an effective punitive tool. In other words, we can use them for punishment. For example, maybe there's another country and they're engaging in uncompetitive or unethical practices. Maybe we're trading with them, but they're doing something uncompetitive that creates a disadvantage for us. Well, for example, at one point, I read an article about China violating US copyright laws. If you go to China, and I've been to China before and I led a study abroad there, we were there for a month, and you can find all kinds of American movies that are bootlegged and they're being sold right in stores. So if China's violating US copyright laws, we really want to put an end to that. So we need to come up with a punishment for them, and it needs to have some teeth, right? So what did we do? We imposed some trade barriers in response to this. Now, I don't recall exactly what we put trade barriers on, but China cares about its volume of trade. If we are mad at them, we want to punish them, trade barriers is one potentially effective way to do it. But we might also be using trade barriers to protect a brand new industry. So we're talking about what we call an infant industry. Maybe it's something that's pretty new, and because it's new, it might not be ready to compete. The problem is if I just open up the door to competition for this infant industry, it might immediately devastate this industry. So protecting this infant industry for a while might make some sense. Now, doing it indefinitely, that's a whole nother story, but doing it to make sure this infant industry gets off the ground and can weather the storm for a little while, yeah, that could be justifiable. Let's talk about how trade benefits Thailand. Thailand's not that big, right? It's a fraction of the United States. And of course, Thailand doesn't want to sell rice only to Thai people, right? That'd be a lot of people, but there's a whole lot of other people in the world. So clearly Thailand wants to sell rice all over the world. That means they need other markets. So Thailand benefits from having access to these other markets. Imagine them selling rice to the United States and selling rice in Europe and selling rice in Canada. Okay, now the game is changed. Export volumes for Thailand go way up. When they can find other markets like this and get involved in global trade, we're going to promote exports. And exports are key for economic growth, right? That's one of the variables we look at to kind of measure how well a country is doing with respect to trade. And so Thailand wants to have as many exports, as much exports in dollar value as it possibly can. Thailand is also a member of the World Trade Organization, which we abbreviate as WTO. Now, we've already said that they're members of trade agreements, but being a member of the World Trade Organization is also very notable because that puts them in the company of 158 other countries. So adding in Thailand, 159 countries in 2023 are members of the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization and all their member countries aspire for free trade. This is an organization where members are agreeing to try to promote free trade. Therefore, member nations agree to certain rules related to trade. And the idea is to promote freer trade and fairer trade. So Thailand, along with a whole bunch of other countries in the world, are working on promoting trade and making it fairer. That means reducing trade barriers to promote more open trade. So if you're a member of the World Trade Organization, there are going to be certain rules related to trade, and it defines the rules of the game in a way to make trade a little fairer, to promote trade openness. In addition, the WTO has a special interest in developing nations. It is a pretty well-established idea that trade is really important for economic growth. So if you want to help developing nations grow, give them access to markets, help them be able to compete globally. So the WTO has programs aimed at developing nations, and they also have agreements that have provisions to promote the interests of developing nations. So again, we're not going to get way too into the WTO, but Thailand being a member is clearly a good thing. So in conclusion, it seems like Thailand is positioning itself well for participation in global trade. Those opportunities to access other markets is crucial for their growth, and that's going to help. Membership in trade agreements is going to give them some of this access. And of course, being a member of the WTO also helps them promote their interests. And these things are going to have favorable effects for Thailand. So let me know if you have any questions, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a fantastic day.